It came up really fast.
And 9-1 for the swimmer.
We had people that were hanging on logs in the river. We had one lady that they had to cut through the roof to get her out of her attic.
750,000 gallons of water a second flowing by us on all sides and behind me and from upriver.
A mile wide, a foot deep for 385 miles. That's 300,000 acre-feet of water. That's how much water came through in 5 days.
We're at 25.
Everything was water from hill to hill.
We could hear cows bawling outside, and then when it got quiet, we knew that there wasn't much hope. It's a crushing blow.
Bigger, more extreme floods appear to be getting worse.
The December 2007 flood in the Chehalis River Basin of southwestern Washington was the worst in the area's recorded history. An altogether different kind of disaster. It caught people unprepared, raising the historic high water mark and the stakes for the 140,000 people who live there. In the aftermath of the flood, boards were formed. People committed to finding a fix. Plans were drawn up for a dam. But those plans present a fundamental challenge to another growing crisis in the region: the destruction of fish habitat.
There's a huge decimation happening and nobody's talking about it. From a historical and cultural perspective, it is a very scary thought.
This is the story of how impacted people from different sides of the debate are working together to address both problems. With so much on the line, whatever they decide will impact the region for generations. This is the story of the Chehalis Basin Board, 10 years after the flood that changed everything.
My biggest fear from Chehalis Basin flooding is that more people will die.
The next 2 years are incredibly important.
In early December 2007, a massive storm borne over the Pacific Ocean made landfall on the southwest coast of Washington, battering coastal areas with hurricane-force winds and carrying unimaginable amounts of rain further inland. When it reached the Willapa Hills in Lewis County, it unleashed 20 inches of rain in just 24 hours. The water raced down steep slopes into streams that feed the Chehalis River, building a flood of historic proportions. The river roared towards homes, farms, and families downstream.
So much came down so fast, it was taking logs and wood and debris and pushing it with it. And the power of water is just, it is absolutely amazing. And you get all those logs, and that's what took the bridges out. Bang, those logs hit that bridge, and it sits there and just takes a few seconds, and the bridge starts shaking, and kaboom, and the whole thing, and then that jam's heading down, and it's picking up speed, and it's picking up more logs, and it's picking up debris, and it's tearing across roads, and it's ripping houses apart, and it's an incredible force of nature that the sounds, what you're seeing, it's surreal.
Steve Mansfield is the Director of Emergency Services for Lewis County. During the December 2007 flood, he was the county sheriff, coordinating rescue operations. Planning for disasters is his business, but this flood caught everyone off guard.
What hit here was something that was not anticipated. It was not what the National Weather Service was able to predict. And it's something that happened very, very rapidly. My day on December 3rd started at about 4 o'clock in the morning, getting a call from one of my staff members advising me that we had just lost 3 bridges. We had people in the water. Everything was just breaking apart. And it was really, really bad.
Flooding is a fact of life for many people in the Chehalis River Basin. But what happened in early December 2007 was like nothing they had ever seen. Houses literally washed into the raging water as the riverbank crumbled, cut away by billions of gallons of swift water. Bridges were knocked out, leaving people stranded. Fishing boats became emergency transport vehicles. Livelihoods, livestock, and at least one human life were swept away as debris-filled water battered the landscape.
I remember telling one entity, I said, you got an 8-foot high wall of water with logs heading your way that will be there within the next 3 hours. So you had better get ready and start evacuating.
The former sheriff called in help from everywhere he could: the Coast Guard, the Navy, the National Guard, King County aerial units, and more. The flooding was so severe, Landmarks and street signs were underwater. Mansfield says it was hard to distinguish different parts of Lewis County from the air. Further upstream, closer to the source of the flooding, in the Boistfort Valley, farms were filling up with water, one by one.
From here to the shop, to that big barn, all of this was water flowing through here.
Marilyn and Dave Finn were cut off by the raging water, which destroyed the bridge that connects them to the outside world.
There was this huge pile of logs that were on the other side of the previous bridge. And so I walked back to the house, and as I was doing so, I heard the sound, and I turned around really quickly, and the log jam that had been here had been able to come loose and whack that bridge and just sent it flying.
I stood there and watched the bridge go away, and you just kind of, you don't know what to say or do. There's nothing you can do about it at the time.
This is the barn that we evacuated first.
Dairy farmers in the region were hit particularly hard.
That's where the water was.
John Brunoff, no exception. He vividly recalls the day a wall of water and debris appeared in the distance, swallowing up the fields, the road, everything, and heading his way.
It was almost like a tidal wave.
By the time Brunoff moved his mother to the second floor, the water was waist deep outside his door.
And by the time we got calves sort of sorted out and moved and put on a trailer, the water was so swift that we could hardly stand in it.
Brunoff wanted to try to make it to the pens, open the gates, give the cows a chance, but his wife warned him he'd never make it back. Their home was filling up with water. They were trapped.
It's indescribable. I mean, it's a crushing blow. Watching some of the cows float by in the current of the river, and the river was moving so fast, or the water was moving so fast that it took them 30 seconds maybe and they were out of sight. And the sounds, I mean, it was eerily quiet, and we could hear cows bawling outside, and then when it got quiet, we knew there wasn't much hope.
Their fears were confirmed at first light. From the herd of nearly 280 cattle, only 20 survived.
It was probably just a state of general numbness. You know, it hadn't sunk in what was ahead of us.
Most of these hay bales would have been completely submerged. When it's just starting to silk and just starting to tassel, you want to make sure it's got plenty of water.
In Elma, large sections of the 900-acre farm that Jay Gordon's family has worked for generations would soon be deep underwater.
Basically about that far off the ground, which would be 10, 11, 12 feet.
Gordon is all too familiar with the threat of flooding on the farm. The Gordon family passed down lessons learned the hard way over a century.
This is what floodplains are for. This is why we don't have houses down here. You know, we're used to it flooding. That's the solution has never been to look for an end to flooding. It's not going to happen, and I don't think anybody realistically wants that. Normal flooding, and normally in areas like this, flooding's just a natural part of what river valleys and floodplains do.
He anticipates periodic flooding and tries to plan for the worst. But in recent years, the worst has become a moving target.
My family's been here since 1872. In '96, the water was 10, 12 inches higher than anything my grandfather had seen. The '07 flood added another 10 inches to that. Way off in the distance, where you see that line of trees, and in '07 and as well as in '06, all these fields behind us were completely flooded. Water got all the way up to these fir trees right here behind the house, and a good sturgeon pole, you could have fished for sturgeon right off the back porch here.
It's as if a river dropped out of the sky, and in a sense, it did, according to hydrologist Larry Karpak.
There was an immense amount of rain came onshore in what's called an atmospheric river.
The storm system that brought torrential rain to the Chehalis River Basin was part of a phenomenon called the Pineapple Express, a conveyor belt of moisture stretching thousands of miles out over the Pacific Ocean, extending from the tropics to the west coast of the U.S. Experts say a single atmospheric river can carry more water than the entire Mississippi River, up to 20 times more.
The rainfall totals were probably on the order of a 500 or 1,000 year rainfall.
Butting up to the Willapa Hills, the small town of PL in Lewis County's timber country was right in the storm's crosshairs. The rain triggered a mudslide which slammed into 2 homes and buried Highway 6 in a mountain of earth and trees. Miraculously, no one was killed.
The rain that was seen here, most of it came in about 12 hours, and the most intense of it was in about 6 hours, and that's caused the rivers to rise much faster than they ever had.
The water moved quickly through the upper watershed where the river channel may be up to 30 feet deep. When it got further downstream and the landscape flattened out, the river spilled out of its banks and onto the surrounding floodplains. When it reached a main constriction point at the Mellon Street Bridge in Centralia, the water slowed down and spread out more. Water topped the airport levee there and swallowed the surrounding area. It poured over I-5, ripped away pavement, and pushed concrete dividers around like coasters. A 20-mile stretch of the interstate that connects Seattle to Portland was out of commission for 4 days. Groceries rotted inside stranded 18-wheelers. The sister cities of Chehalis and Centralia were left with the wasteland of ruined property, drowned animals, and broken dreams.
This was during Christmas season, so this will kind of give you an idea of what a flood can do with 6 to 8 feet of water inside a building. I watched about $3.5 million of inventory at cost get wet in about 15 to 20 minutes. The one reason we stayed in business and stayed strong was not for my co-partner and I, it was for our employees.
In the midst of the devastation and tragedy, hope arrived, carrying mops and hauling heavy equipment. Volunteers poured into the area, bringing supplies and willing hands to flood-stricken families.
Afterwards, the people that showed up to help was just heartwarming, astonishing, lots of ways of describing it. Renews your faith in humanity. After you watch the local TV news for a while, you think the world is going to end, but then people show up, and people came from everywhere. Mennonites came from New York. They came from Vanderhoof, British Columbia. Kids crawled around in the mud cleaning out under houses. It was astonishing.
The Finns moved on, but they didn't move. Their home is now covered in pieces of lumber that were salvaged from flood debris during the cleanup.
With the bad of listening to cows drowned at night comes the good of seeing a community help those families rebuild.
Hey girls, come here, come on.
John Brunoff had mixed emotions about his next step.
After it first happened, then I thought, you know, are we gonna put cattle back here and then have them at risk again of this happening again? It was a real tough decision. We decided to go ahead with it with the help of the Washington State Dairy Federation. They had a cattle donation program, and we had so much help, people that donated things and money, time. The whole effort was tremendous and a totally humbling experience. And looking back, it was an experience that I don't want to do again, but it made me a better person.
10 years after the December 2007 flooding, people are reflecting on the vulnerability it exposed. Larry Karpak says it was an unprecedented event both in the scope of the flooding and in how quickly it developed. But the basic path of the storm was not unusual. The Willapa Hills are the first natural feature high enough to draw rainfall out of offshore storms coming inland. They are frequently the target of huge rain events when they happen. and rain-driven floods are expected to become more common in the future.
The estimate is that the 100-year flood may increase by about 65%, 66% in the next 50 years.
Before that happens, Lewis County Commissioner Edna Fund wants to take concrete steps to offset some of the danger for her constituents.
So we do not have people thinking, well, we don't want to move to Lewis County or we don't want to stay in Lewis County because our flood insurance will be high. We have to watch out for flooding. We have to make sure that we've built on soil that won't be impacted by flooding. I want that to disappear.
Many stakeholders believe a dam is the only way to make a significant dent in the flooding. But flooding isn't the only problem in the Chehalis River Basin.
We're very close to the spot where the Black River and the Chehalis River join, and that particular spot and that location has been home to the Chehalis tribe for as long as there has been a Chehalis tribe. Our tribe has been here since before recorded history. Have been relying on these fish runs since before recorded history.
In an era where Washington State has started demolishing dams to restore fish habitat, tribal representatives are skeptical about building a new one.
Any solution that we come up with to reduce flood damage is going to have an impact to the fishery. And that is a worry for the tribal members.
David Burnett is the former chairman of the Confederated Tribes of the Chehalis Reservation near Oakville. The reservation was also in the path of the 2007 flood.
There was damage from the 2007 flood on the reservation. However, our primary population centers are on higher ground. It's kind of something that we know and we expect every year that there's going to be flooding, and so it's something that we've grown to live with.
Historically, many dams have seriously impacted salmon populations by blocking their critical spawning routes. Salmon are born inland in fresh water. They migrate out to sea but return to the same waters where they were born to reproduce. The Chehalis is the only river basin in the state with no federally endangered salmon species. But tribal stakeholders fear that could change without supportive action from people. That includes Quinault Indian Nation Vice President Tyson Johnston.
It's an intangible part of who I am and my community and the communities that are connected to it also. This is part of our way of life. There's a spiritual and intangible connection to it.
The Quinault Reservation spans more than 200,000 acres from the Pacific coast inland. It's an area rich in resources and natural beauty.
In the 50s and 60s, these lands were decimated. Terrible forest practices, overfishing.
Johnston says the tribe has had to fight to protect the natural resources so closely tied to their identity.
Not only do we have rights to harvest those fish and those natural resources, we also co-manage them of equal legal footing with the state of Washington. And so the flood impacts and the flood mitigation projects that are proposed impact those heavily, depending on which alternative we're talking about.
We're trying to come up with a solution that involves a dam. And in the history of dams, there has never been a dam that has been beneficial to a fish population. And that's a big challenge, and that's one of the reasons why we can't reach a solution too quickly or rush to those conclusions.
As fish productivity declines, flood risks appear to be rising. 5 of the worst floods in the Chehalis River Basin's history have occurred in the last 30 years. That includes a major flood in 2009, just 2 years after the worst flood on record. Without action, flooding could cost the region an estimated $3.5 billion over the next century, and certain species of fish could disappear. Both are complicated problems that cross numerous jurisdictional lines. Both have been major points of contention between different governing bodies across the basin. In 2011, state lawmakers took steps to launch a unified effort to deal with both problems at the regional level, with help from collaborative policy specialists at the William D. Ruckelshaus Center. Those efforts culminated in the creation of the Chehalis Basin Board, a diverse group of decision makers reflecting local, state, and tribal governments. Now, for the first time, instead of representing different interests, they share 2 inseparable goals: reducing flood damage and improving aquatic habitat at the same time. With insight from experts in various fields and support from a new wing of the State Department of Ecology, the board is now weighing a list of possible projects. The plans include building or raising levees to protect people and property, from the coastal cities of Aberdeen and Hoquiam to the twin cities of Chehalis and Centralia. There's also a proposal to put up walls and levees along I-5 to protect the interstate. The most fish-friendly major project on the list is the restorative flood protection option. This plan calls for reconnecting the floodplain to the river to encourage it to hold more water during floods, then planting trees and placing obstacles to keep it there as long as possible. It would increase flooding in one part of the region to decrease flooding in another. This would require buying up homes and farms and relocating residents and crops. It would also require willingness from property owners. Then there's the plan to build a dam. A site has been selected in the Willapa Hills on the main stem of the Chehalis River. That's where hydrologists say most of the excess water enters the river during major floods. One design would be a flood retention only dam with gates which could allow water and fish to move freely most of the time, but could close during floods. The temporary reservoir could stretch nearly 7 miles and be up to 220 feet deep at the dam. The other dam design would create a permanent reservoir to hold back that much water year-round. But during floods, the reservoir could be up to 60 feet deeper and stretch close to a mile longer. Both designs would have some sort of fish passage mechanism for when water is being retained. The ultimate solution could be a combination of actions, but any construction related to flood reduction must be accompanied by enough habitat restoration to ensure a net positive for fish.
When I think about asking farmers to leave their fertile land and to move up, that's a tough one for me to swallow.
There's been a long and sad history of failure at the federal level, state level, and local level when it comes to both of these problems.
Chehalis attorney Jay Vanderstoep believes a dam must be part of the solution.
About a third of the community would have been protected that was otherwise flooded. In the flood of 10 years ago, in 2007, in 5 days, 300,000 acre-feet of water came through these communities. An acre-foot is a football field 1 foot deep. That's basically 1 acre-foot of water. 300,000 acre-feet of water is get in your car in Chehalis, drive to the Canadian border, drive halfway up British Columbia to Kamloops, and there you would have just traveled 385 miles, okay? So a mile wide, a foot deep for 385 miles, that's 300,000 acre-feet of water. That's how much water came through in 5 days. So it gets you to the understanding very quickly that small measures, given that catastrophic amount of water, will not significantly benefit the families and the communities in the basin.
I spend most of my time working on dam removal.
Environmental consultant Steve Mallock says there's a delicate balancing act underway and the outcome is far from certain.
The dam will impact fish. The question is whether the other things that we do in the Chehalis program more than overcome those impacts.
Once upon a time, the river basin was well adapted to flooding. The river would overflow its banks, water would spill into forested floodplains, and trees would slow it down, according to Mallock. But now he says the river basin is less resilient, and the river channel is so deeply incised that floodwater roars through it like a fire hose that blasts away bridges and inundates homes.
We're standing on the banks of the Chehalis River. During the 2007 and 2009 floods, water was tens of feet above me right here. That kind of really intense flood is really difficult to hold back. And then there's going to be a very tough conversation within the environmental and the tribal community about whether the trade-off of potential aquatic species is worth the impact of the dam.
It's a hard sell.
I think the nation is open to letting science kind of drive that decision, but I'm really skeptical about any kind of dam being developed that could meet those kind of issues, or making sure that fisheries are protected. I haven't seen that happen, and I'm open to seeing it happen, but until that does, the nation is very clear on our stance.
The solution that evokes the most response always is the mention of the word dam. People have an instinctive reaction to say that that's a bad thing for fish. Looking at that solution certainly we need to allow the science to play out and make sure that we fully understand all the ramifications for the fish populations.
The next 2 years, we need to finish the studies. We need to be done with the studies.
According to the State Department of Ecology, there have been more than 830 studies related to flooding in the Chehalis River Basin. Jay Gordon thinks it's time to take action.
My grandfather had been part of a community of farmers after the 1933 and the 1934 floods that the Corps of Engineers had come in and said, oh, we'll help you, we'll figure this out. We'll dike things or we'll dredge things or whatever they did in 1936. And that came to nothing. Doing nothing is an option, but oh my gosh, is it a poor option. We've done that since 1936. So there's where the emotion comes is all of these solutions we can build. It's not a matter of whether we can engineer and design or improve a fishery. We know how to do that. It's whether we're going to or not.
There is a danger in reacting too quickly and not allowing the studies to be all played out and to try to presuppose what those results of the studies are going to be. So it becomes...
As I look at the history and how far we've come, I think now we have a chance to make this happen. The stars are aligned. We've got things that are happening that have never happened before.
We need to think generations into the future, and that there's things happening in the climate that we can't engineer our way out of.
I'm not proud to be in an area that has these flood events, but this is where I'm at and where life put us.
It's controversial, but it's huge. And unless we do something, we know that this will happen again. Are we willing to accept the consequences of it happening, get through it, and move on? Or do we as a community want to step forward and try and do something with some sort of water retention? And without taking a position one way, we're either not going to do anything and go through this again and work through it, or we're going to do something and mitigate some of the damage. Either one of these things has its ups and downs. And it's very controversial. You have people worried about the fish, you have people worried about another dam in an area where it could break. A lot of issues here. And there's been a lot of dialogue and a lot of back and forth for years now. And I really think the time's now to make a decision. What are we as a community going to do? Are we willing to accept the consequences of whatever those choices are? And this is an exciting time because some choices are going to be made here, I hope, in the next couple years, one way or another.